Hi, and thanks for joining Making Waves on Purpose. Today I'm joined by Nandika Magdavgar. Nandika is the head of strategic engagement and growth for Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose and also runs CECP's CEO Investor Forum. I have known her for several years and really admire the work that she and Daryl and Carrie and Kate and Mika and Leah, many others at CECP do. She also worked at MetLife as in their corporate responsibility program as well as for Citigroup, so has a wealth of experience to draw on. We talked about diversity and inclusion and the importance of intangibles and trust and empathy, and I think you will get a lot out of, as I did, from this conversation. So with no further ado, I bring you Nandika. Nandika, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. Excited to be here.
So tell us, what are you doing these days?
That's a big question. What am I doing these days? So at Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, which is where I work, it's a small nonprofit organization that punches above its weight, I think. And so as a senior member of the leadership team, there are a number of key initiatives that I work on, but primarily really I'm like the chief growth officer, if you will. And my primary responsibility is to look at recruitment, philanthropic investments, and strategic engagement with our affiliated companies. And that's primarily what my team and I do on a day-to-day basis. Over and above that, obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into thinking about and kind of looking ahead at what our companies might need, sort of working across CECP with my colleagues on issues that we see coming up that we need to focus our efforts on. It's a lot about product development and services that we think our companies could benefit from. And so just constantly keeping up with what's happening in both the business world and also in sort of the social environment and the sort of our larger environment that we live in, just focusing on those issues to see what we can bring in-house to help our companies think about issues and situations that they might be facing.
I love that. I love the forward-looking nature of that, the kind of peering through the looking glass to see what's coming around the corner. I think that's so important because I think so many corporate responsibility executives, leaders, what have you, in the space, whether that's on the nonprofit side or on the for-profit side, they believe somehow this is all going to sunset and we're going to all work our way out of jobs. And I've said this before, I think that's just the height of silliness because there's always going to be another issue. There's always going to be another expansion of the role of business in society and what it means to be a responsible corporate citizen, air quotes. How have you seen it change and how do you see it changing? Because I know you came from Citi and now you're at CECP, so you've got a pretty broad lens.
Yeah, no, and it's so interesting because when I started, like now, what is it, maybe 20 plus odd years ago, when I started out at Citi, corporate responsibility was still pretty much this thing we did on the side as a part of doing good, right? Like there was, as one of my previous managers said, it was like a sprinkling of goodness. And that's what corporate responsibility used to be all about. And then over the course of the last couple of decades, I've seen this shift where it's become it's become really about making an impact. It's about outcomes. It's about output. It's like much more data-driven than it used to be, where we've gone past doing just glossy corporate responsibility reports to really thinking about corporate responsibility in an integrated fashion. And what does that look like in your sort of annual report that you put out? So it's not corporate responsibility here and our annual report on financials and business on this side, right? Like it's all slowly getting integrated. And I think that's really powerful because the whole narrative is not just about how you're doing on your stock price. It's about how are you looking after your employees? How are you looking after your society and communities where you live and work? And I think that's all coming together. And I've seen it all come together over the last 2 decades. And I think I'm really excited about what the future looks like because now we want everyone at the table. We want the voice of corporate responsibility, the voice of HR, the voice of finance, and even the voice of investors at the table, right? I mean, that's in an ideal world where we can actually make change happen because we're all working together. That's a big thing that I've learned particularly over the pandemic, has been this, that we need to co-create to win, right? Especially when you're facing a crisis, whether it's the Turkey Syria earthquake, whether it's COVID 19, whether it's climate change. I think when we all co create and collaborate, it trumps being competitive. And there's always been this sort of hesitation on part of large organizations to really share what they might be doing, right? And so some of the things that transparency that we want, because that helps us build a better world together. And I think that's one of the things at CECP that we have been encouraging our companies to be more transparent and to share where we can share together through our peer networking, through our events that we host, where we can actually talk about challenges we are facing. And we are not just talking about, everything that's going well, but what's not going well and how are we fixing that? I think that's been a huge change that I've seen within the corporate responsibility world of practitioners.
I think that's great. I love your point on co-creation. I'm wondering how we do that around issues that are becoming so hyper politicized. We look at, and companies kind of get drug into this. I had a conversation with Zeev Klein on red companies, blue companies. We see, there's a lot of pushback on ESG within heavily red states in the legislatures. I think based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what ESG is, or a weaponization of an idea of something that it really isn't. But talk about how, to the extent you can, companies are thinking about that and this idea of co-creation when it doesn't seem, in some ways, we can even decide what the problems are right now across party lines, and companies are kind of trying to navigate in that space.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think when we talk about media and what we see there, whether it's your social channels or your big news outlets, I think they tend to focus more on the negative, right? It's negativity makes news. We know that, right? Like, who wants to tell a good story, right? That's not going to get you the viewers you want or the clicks that you need. So I truly feel that the practitioners who are in-house within these organizations are really committed and dedicated individuals who are not caught up in this politicization. They are working to solve key issues, right? They are working to solve hunger in some places. They're working to solve education issues in other places. They're working to solve mental health issues in certain communities. They are not focused on the politics of it all. And they shouldn't be. I mean, that's not what their focus is. And while I think we are seeing a lot of this ESG pushback, I'm also seeing a lot of support for creating this alternative narrative through education and working on messaging with our companies that is a counter to what this anti-ESG conversation has been. And that narrative and that education, which at CCP we are deeply involved with, is going to be something that will counter this very politicized world that we live in today. And counter it, maybe it won't be, who knows, right? Like it's not going to be the silver bullet. But I do think that as much as there's that anti-ESG red-blue thing going on, there's also a lot of people who are actually in the field and working day to day. I think they are really committed to what needs to happen, the change that needs to happen. And I don't think they're that pulled into the politicization. I mean, we can have a separate conversation on that, but I don't think that, personally, I don't think the people we work with, I've not heard that this has been a big issue for them.
That's interesting, because I've talked to a lot of people who are either looking at talking less about their program so that they don't come under the microscope, continuing to make the investments, but being a little more shy. I think it's really interesting. You talked about media and, social media, like the business models of clickbait and going for, the negative story. Like there's something wrong with that business model. And, the Edelman Trust Barometer came out, and shockingly, employee newsletters are the most well-trusted source of news for many employees,
Right.
which is really surprising how much trust in business, which, is pretty unabashedly profit-driven. And I totally agree with you. I think CR has made a dent. I don't think it has changed mindsets to the extent that we need it to within boards and leadership teams. And I think that's still an ongoing process and will be for quite some time. But I'm really interested and it's funny, I have mixed feelings about this. I understand the point that we shouldn't dig in on the politics or give too much oxygen to it. But at the same time, in the era of identity politics, can we really call ourselves diverse and inclusive if we can't talk about our political feelings? And is there a way to deconflict those conversations to say, hey, listen, this is why I'm a Republican or this is why I'm a Democrat? Right. But a discussion for another day. Where do you hope this all goes next? You've talked a little bit about where it's changed, and where do you see, because sounds like there's a really looking glass future forward part of your job. What are you most excited about or nervous about?
And before I jump into that, Jeff, there's something you said about boards, which I think is very, very important to bring into this conversation. I believe, and at CCP, one of the things that we are constantly thinking about and working with our company, affiliated companies with, is on educating boards and bringing them along so that they can support their executives and their CEOs, especially those who want to stand up for what is right and who are trying to make change happen. But as we know, change takes a long time to happen, right? And a lot of the work that we've been doing, whether it's thought leadership or research or actually presenting to board of directors of our companies, I think that's a big part of this future change. I'm tying it back to your question about how do I see this change happening? What does the future look like? I think it's really when boards understand that ESG and corporate responsibility are actually a positive for the bottom line, and it's not something discretionary that companies can do. And I think when the board supports its senior executives in doing the right thing, even though they take a hit in the short term, I think that's when the future of how companies are going to be agents of change will really come into play. You can have as many activist investors pushing you. You can have institutional investors asking for more. But I think in many instances, if the board is not behind the executive who's in charge at that particular moment in time of history, it's really hard for that executive to make change happen. So when we think about the future, what does the future of this ESG world look like? I think it is when the board is on board. Second, when you have public-private partnerships that are really effective and work well together. And in this instance, like, for example, the company that comes to mind is MasterCard, that has done this masterfully, pun upon pun, not intended, where they have really worked with governments and local governments, and they've brought their business model to play to make massive social change while also helping the business, right? It's a very interesting case study of what MasterCard has done, especially through their Center for Financial Inclusion, I think it is called. You can just look up that name and put that in the notes section of the podcast. I don't want to get the name wrong. But I think that's a great example of how, when we think about what the future of this particular industry or this particular sector is going to look like, it's going to be about, I think, those two things. It's the bringing the board along and public-private partnerships.
That's fascinating. And there's a whole nother discussion to have around private-public partnerships. If you think about where CECP lives at the confluence of a lot of this, you've got investors, you've got boards, you've got reporting, you've got public-private partnerships, which are all levers of change. They're all ways to where you started this to punch above your weight. to be more impactful. And that's how companies are trying to expand their value proposition and values proposition. You also said something that's really interesting, do what is right. I think, as I said, as these things kind of develop out, like we can't champion Patagonia and their kind of values-based leadership or MasterCard and not champion Hobby Lobby or Chick-fil-A or some that might have a different view on these things. Chick-fil-A's leadership has come out, not the company itself, but its leadership has come out on less open thinking around sexual orientation. Hobby Lobby has been pro-life rather than pro-choice. And it's an interesting balance because it's got what's got to be good for the goose has to be good for the gander, right? Like we have to accept it on the other side, which is a really challenging position in this space of how we continue to support companies to bring their values to bear when those values might be different than we would want them to.
It's an interesting, and absolutely, you're absolutely right. And I think this is the interesting balancing act that an organization like CCP can play, right? Because we believe in engaging and not shaming companies, right? So we totally understand that there are going to be certain companies that have certain strong values and that they're going to champion them. Our role, I think, is to understand where they're coming from and to the point where we think it is impacting negatively social core values or socially, just impacting in a negative way the world we want to build for future generations, then I think it is our responsibility to be that trusted advisor, not necessarily to change their minds tomorrow or the day after, but to continue to have that conversation that can hopefully allow for a change of mind down the road, right? I think we understand that there are differences within our world, right? There are differences between you and me, for example, right? In the beliefs that we have. But what we believe in is having this conversation, not necessarily not having the conversation. Not having the conversation is not an option to doing anything that you want to do in terms of pushing something that we believe is really important to us, which is creating that value for the future, right? That sustainable value for the future. Whether that's the climate, whether that's society, whether that's governance, it's creating this ecosystem that supports every level of economic society, not just the 1% or it really comes down to sort of thinking about like businesses serve many objectives beyond shareholder value. That's what we believe. It's right. And purpose, which is a part of our name at Chief Executives for Corporate Purpose, it is more than a slogan. And that's what we've been trying to educate our companies on and also celebrate those who really believe that and have that as a part of their core business objective. So for us, it's beyond shareholder value. It's about all your stakeholders. And in that instance, if it's Hobby Lobby or it's Unilever, it's how are we building those bridges and how are we accepting each other's differences, but really driving towards that common North Star of what is the purpose today for all of us who live on this earth? What is our purpose, right? What does that mean at the end of it all, right? And I think, I don't know, for me, it's like, what am I leaving for future generations? What kind of a world am I going to leave for future generations?
Which is the core definition of sustainability, right? To leave it as good or better than we found it. I love your points too on engagement. I'm a big believer. Like I'm a huge supporter of the D&I movement. I'm very critical of cancel culture because I don't believe we can exclude ourselves into inclusion. I think that's really tricky.
I think the only thing I wanted to end with, of everything that we've spoken about, I think it is, to me, it's the intangibles that drive value, not the bottom line. And what I mean by that is, and we've touched upon this over the course of this conversation, is that it is reputation, trust, access to talent that cannot be measured in a traditional way. And people may not take that into consideration as much as they should. But really, that is so important to long-term success. And so let's not always sideline the intangibles and follow sort of KPIs and metrics, which we need to do to measure the intangibles to some extent, but let's not forget that trust and our employees and our talent is really what will drive success for the future. So I just wanted to talk about that. Yeah, just I wanted to mention that.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. I look forward to seeing what the clip sounds like.
All right. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.